If you've ever used enhancers, you probably know how cool they can sound and how wide they can make a mono track. Even too much when they're not used properly. But they also bring their own dose of problems. For example, some of them are not mono-compatible because they invert the phase on one channel, other add a delay on one of the two channels. So when you recombine the two channels of a stereo track, they create this phasey mess. Other types are mono-compatible, for example those that use two complementary COM filters that when summed to mono reconstruct the original signal. But when you listen to only one of those channels, you hear a confiltered signal. And that's a problem, for example, when you play live, because if some people in the audience is too close to one of the speakers, they'll hear only that one channel. And again, it will be a pretty phasey and not so pleasant sound. What if there's a way to solve all of these issues? Hopefully that's what I'm going to do today with the idea I came up with. I had this idea when I stumbled upon this plugin, which I've had on my PC for years, but I've never touched it until today. And when I saw what it can do, I immediately thought of doing this thing. Basically, it can rotate the phase of the two channels by whichever degree you want. So not only a polarity inversion, so 180 degrees, but anything in between. As you probably know, when you sum two signals with inverted polarity, they completely cancel each other out. Because when the wave has a certain positive value, it will have the same opposite negative value on the other channel, and so when they sum, the result is basically zero. But what happens when the phase rotation is not 180 degrees but less? Basically, the only thing that changes is the intensity of the signal. But apart from that, the resulting waveform is basically identical to the original. And you can see it in this nice visualizer. You see, we have two sine waves, which when they are aligned, they produce an identical sine wave, which has double the amplitude. If we invert the polarity on one of those, so 180 degree, here is what happens. Basically no signal. But for example, what happens when we sum two sine waves that are 90 degrees apart, like this? Well, this is what happens. Again, same waveform, but this time instead of being double the amplitude, it is basically 1.4 times larger, or better said, root square of 2 times larger. Here is what happens instead at 120 degree. You can see that this time it basically have the same exact amplitude, and that's because the peak corresponds to the point where the two original waves intersect, and that's exactly at half the amplitude of the original waveform. And I want to point out that this is not the same as applying a delay to the signal, because this phase shift is identical for all frequencies in this case, so it doesn't create a COM filter. But there's a problem. This plugin actually can be run in real time, since to do this phase rotation it uses linear phase filters, and so it introduces a good amount of latency. My DAW reports 47.7 milliseconds, and that's too much to play in real time. So how can we solve this issue and apply this stuff in our modelers, for example? Well, even though we don't have a block dedicated for this in our modelers, in our Fractal, we can import IRs, and those, if we pay attention to not use a minimum phase transform or the auto trim function when importing them, they preserve the phase information of the IR. So I loaded one of my IRs in my DAW, I put it in a stereo track. On this track I loaded the Voxengo plugin, and then I just bounced this track and imported this stereo IR in my FM9. Actually, I created different versions of this IR with different phase rotation values, so that I can choose how wide I want my guitar to be and try different combinations directly on the FM9. And here's how they sound. So this is one IR alone, panned in the center. Listen what happens when I switch the second IR in and pan them left and right. Also listen what happens when I sum them to mono. Basically no issues, just a slightly reduced level compared to using just one IR. In this case it's not so evident because the phase rotation is 60 degrees only, but let's try the other IRs. It's already too wide for my tastes. Let's hear this sum to mono. Here the volume loss is quite evident, and we have a volume loss because when summing to mono, the XFX, or basically any DAW, subtract 6 dB from the signal to maintain the same output level. But when doing it on out of phase signals, obviously those 6 dB are too much, cause in this case, as we've seen previously, with a 90-degree rotation between the two channels, we only get a 1.4 times level increase, which is basically 3 dBs. And so when we sum them to mono with the level compensation of the fractal, the result is we have a signal which is lower by 3 dB, because it is -6 plus 3 dB. Let's try an even wider setting, which is 120 degrees. And in this case we have 6 dB of difference. To my ears, the one that sounds best is the -30 plus 30, which is basically a total of 60-degree rotation, because it's the one that sounds just about right in terms of wideness, and also it doesn't cause too much level reduction when summing to mono. Let's hear once again the difference. This is mono. Eventually I can even use a wider one, but instead of hard panning them, I can choose to pan them, let's say, -50 and +50. And I get a very similar result, even though it has a lower level, obviously. But I can compensate with the level. Well, -+30 is the one that sounds best anyway to me. Obviously, feel free to experiment with different values. For sure, some in-between values might sound good, especially those on the lower side, because when the phase rotation is too much, you can hear this weird, too much wide sound that is not so pleasant and makes you feel a bit dizzy, maybe. Well, with lower values, it adds this three-dimensionality to the sound, which is quite pleasant. And as we've seen with this method, there's basically almost no drawbacks, neither when we sum the signal to mono, nor when we only listen to one speaker, because both will be identical to the original mono signal, so no issues there. The only issue might arise if the signal is not mono, meaning that if, for example, you use a delay like the 2290, which by default has the right channel phase reversed, you won't get that same stereo effect you get when there's no phase rotation on the IRs. I'll let you hear it. Basically, instead of being on 180-degree inversion between the two channels, you have to subtract the rotation applied by the IR. So in this case it is 60. That means that the delay will be rotated only by 120 degrees. It's still wider than the dry signal, but it's a bit narrower than what it is with normal IRs. So keep that in mind. This can probably also be used in mixing. For example, one of the problems that today's mixing engineers face is to make sure that a particular song sounds good also on mono speakers like Bluetooth speakers or smartphones and so on. And when doing so, there's the problem that stereo tracks, for example double track guitars, hard pan left and right, when collapsed to mono, they usually disappear, and that's cause summing two similar but not identical signals, the sum in average is 3 dB louder than the two tracks alone. On mono signals instead, which are basically two identical signals in the two speakers, when summed to mono, this increases by 6 dB the level. And so, in a mix, mono tracks panned heart center when summed to mono will be basically 3 dB louder than tracks which are hard panned left and right. So this same idea could be used in those cases, for example, to put this phase rotation on mono tracks, for example a bass or a drum kick, and by doing so you make them slightly stereo, but at the same time, when the song is played on a mono speaker, the difference in level between those center panned instruments and those hard panned instruments won't be as wide as it is when this phase rotation is not applied. So that might be an idea. I haven't tried yet, but I have some confidence it might work. Let me know in the comments what you think of this idea, or if somehow I missed some aspect of it that might make it not practical or useful. For what I've seen, it's a good idea, I think. Let me know also if you try it, how it works for you, and I think that's all. See you in the next video. Bye!